She had been crying for 3 years. Every night, alone in her small bedroom, Lady Eleanor Ashford wept for the life she had lost, for the love that had destroyed her, for the scandal that had cast her out of London society like a piece of broken china. They called her the ruined rose of London. No decent man would even look at her anymore. No respectable family would invite her to their home. She was damaged goods, a cautionary tale mothers whispered to their daughters. But on one fateful evening at the Winterbourne Ball, the most desired bachelor in all of England, the Duke of Silverton himself, did something that shocked every soul in that glittering ballroom. What he offered her in front of 500 witnesses would either destroy them both or rewrite her entire destiny. This is that story. Eleanor sat by the window of her modest cottage in Somerset, watching the rain streak down the glass. The cottage was small, just 3 rooms, but it was all she could afford on the tiny inheritance her mother had left her. Her father's estate had been sold to pay his debts after he died. Debts of honor, they called them. But there was no honor in dying of a broken heart because your daughter had brought shame to the family name. She was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. Her days were simple and painfully predictable. She woke at dawn, managed her small household with the help of one elderly maid, read books from the village lending library, and went to bed early. And every night, without fail, she cried. Sometimes it was just a few tears. Other nights, it was the kind of sobbing that left her gasping for breath, her pillow soaked, her eyes swollen by mourning. She cried for her father. She cried for her lost reputation. She cried for the naive girl she had been 3 years ago, the girl who had believed in love and happy endings. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor recognized her cousin's handwriting immediately. Lady Margaret Thornfield had been one of the few people who had stood by her after the scandal, though even Margaret had kept her distance for the first year. Society's judgment was brutal, and no one wanted to be tainted by association. Eleanor broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick cream paper. Margaret's words were warm and insistent. She was writing to invite Eleanor to London for the final grand ball of the season, the Winterbourne Ball. It would be held in 3 weeks at the Duke of Winterbourne's mansion, and it would be the event of the year. Margaret's husband had secured invitations, and she desperately wanted Eleanor to attend. "It has been 3 years, dearest Eleanor," Margaret had written. "3 years of exile is long enough. Come to London. Stay with us. Hold your head high for one evening. Show them that you have survived. Show them that you are more than the worst moment of your life." Eleanor set the letter down, her hands trembling. Return to London? Face the people who had shunned her? The very idea made her feel sick. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A small, stubborn spark of defiance. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe 3 years was long enough to hide. To understand why Eleanor had been hiding, you have to understand what happened to her 3 years ago. Back then, she had been London's brightest star. She was 19 years old, beautiful, charming, and full of hope. Her father was a baronet, not wealthy but respectable, and Eleanor had caught the eye of Lord Edmund Hartley, a handsome viscount with an easy smile and a talent for making a girl feel like she was the only woman in the world. Edmund had courted her properly at first. Flowers, poetry, careful conversations in crowded drawing rooms. Then came the private meetings in the garden, the stolen kisses, the whispered promises. He told her he loved her. He told her he wanted to marry her, but his family would never approve because her dowry was too small. He had a solution, though. They would elope. Run away to Scotland, get married at Gretna Green, and return as husband and wife. His family would have no choice but to accept it. Eleanor, young and desperately in love, had believed every word. On the night they were supposed to elope, she had given herself to him completely. It seemed right. They would be married within days. Why should they wait? Edmund had been so gentle, so loving, so convincing. The next morning, she woke up alone. Edmund was gone. Her small traveling bag was gone. And most devastating of all, the envelope containing her dowry, money her father had given her the night before for safekeeping, was gone too. He had taken everything, her virtue, her money, and her trust, and vanished like smoke. He did not run to Scotland. He ran to Italy. And he made sure everyone knew why he ran. Within a week, all of London was whispering about how Lord Edmund Hartley had seduced the foolish Eleanor Ashford, taken her innocence and her dowry, and fled the country laughing. Some people blamed Edmund, calling him a scoundrel and a cad. But far more people blamed Eleanor. She should have known better. She should have protected herself. She had been reckless, stupid, and now she was ruined. No decent man would marry her now. Her father, a proud man who valued his family's honor above all else, took the shame hard. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, and 3 months after the scandal broke, he died quietly in his sleep. The doctor said it was his heart, but Eleanor knew the truth. He had died of shame, and it was her fault. Her mother, already frail, retreated to a relative's home in the countryside and passed away within the year. Eleanor was left alone with nothing but a small cottage, a tiny income, and a reputation in ruins. The ruined rose, they called her. A pretty flower crushed underfoot. For 3 years, she had lived in Somerset, far from London, far from the whispers and the pitying looks. She helped the local vicar's wife with charity work. She read books. She took long walks through the countryside. And she cried. Every single night, she cried for the life that had been stolen from her. Now, holding Margaret's letter in her hands, Eleanor made a decision. She would go to London. She would attend the Winterbourne ball. Not because she hoped anything would change. Not because she believed society would forgive her. But because she needed to prove to herself that she could walk into a room full of people who despised her and survive it. Just once, she would hold her head high. Just once, she would face her demons. And then she would return to Somerset and live out the rest of her quiet, lonely life in peace. She picked up her pen and wrote back to Margaret. Yes, she would come. Yes, she would attend the ball. And yes, she was terrified. But she was also tired of being afraid. 3 years of tears was enough. It was time to find out if she had any courage left. What Eleanor did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that her decision to attend that ball would change everything. Because in London, a man had already noticed her. A powerful man. A man who had seen her tears and decided to do something about them. The Duke of Silverton was waiting, and he had a plan that would shock the entire city. Julian Grayson, the 8th Duke of Silverton, was the most eligible bachelor in England, and he was thoroughly sick of it. At 32 years old, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and blessed with a kind of dark good looks that made debutantes blush and stumble over their words. His fortune was immense, his estates sprawling across 3 counties, and his title was one of the oldest and most respected in the realm. Every mother in London had him at the top of her list. Every young lady practiced writing Duchess of Silverton in her diary. He could have his pick of any woman in society, and yet, season after season, he remained unmarried. It was not that Julian was against marriage. He wanted a wife, a partner, someone he could actually talk to when the ballrooms emptied and the masks came off. But everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. Calculated smiles, rehearsed compliments, women who wanted his title and his money but had no interest in the man who came with them. They performed for him like actresses on a stage, and he was tired of the show. Julian had not always been cynical about love. When he was 25, before he inherited the title, he had fallen deeply in love with a baron's daughter named Lydia. She had seemed different from the others, genuine and warm. They had talked for hours about books and philosophy and their dreams for the future. He had been on the verge of proposing when his uncle, the 7th Duke, died suddenly, and Julian inherited everything. Within a week, Lydia had broken things off and married an earl. She sent him a brief note explaining that an earl's title was more established, more certain, and she hoped he understood. He understood perfectly. She had never loved him. She had loved what he might become, and when a better offer came along, she took it. Since then, Julian had attended every ball, every dinner party, every social event with a polite smile and a guarded heart. He danced with the right ladies, made the right small talk, and went home alone. His friends told him he was too picky, too cautious, too demanding. Perhaps they were right. But he would rather be alone than trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking bank account and a prestigious name. Everything changed 2 months before the Winterbourne ball. Julian had traveled to Somerset to visit his friend Lord Hastings, whose estate bordered a small village. On his second day there, he decided to take a morning ride through the countryside. The weather was fine, and he needed to clear his head after another tedious dinner party where 3 different mothers had tried to arrange private moments between him and their daughters. As he rode through the village, he noticed a young woman outside the butcher's shop. She was plainly dressed in a faded blue pelisse that had clearly been mended more than once. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips, and her bonnet was simple and out of fashion. But there was something about her that made him slow his horse. She was speaking to a thin, ragged woman with 3 small children clinging to her skirts. The poor woman was crying, and the young lady was pressing something into her hand, coins from the look of it, and then a wrapped package that smelled like fresh bread. Julian watched from a distance as the young lady spoke gently to the children, smoothing down their messy hair and making them smile. When she finally walked away, he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was not the polished, practiced beauty of London ballrooms. This was something quieter, more real. There was sadness in her eyes, a heaviness in the way she carried herself, but also a kind of dignity that took his breath away. He asked the butcher who she was. The man looked uncomfortable. "That's Lady Eleanor Ashford, Your Grace. She lives in the cottage at the end of Willowbrook Lane. Poor lass. Tragic story, really." The butcher lowered his voice. "She was ruined by a scoundrel 3 years back. Lord Edmund Hartley, the blackguard, seduced her, took her dowry, and ran off to Italy. Her father died of the shame, and she's been living here ever since, quiet as a mouse. Does charity work with the vicar's wife. Good heart, that one, even after everything." Julian felt something twist in his chest. Ruined. That word, so casually thrown around in society, as if a woman's entire worth could be destroyed by one mistake, one betrayal. He had heard of Edmund Hartley. The man was a known gambler and a rake, the kind of smooth-talking villain who left broken hearts and empty purses in his wake. And this woman, this Lady Eleanor, had been one of his victims. Over the next week, Julian found himself riding past her cottage more often than was strictly necessary. He never approached her, never spoke to her. He simply observed. He saw her tending her small garden, her hands dirty and her face peaceful. He saw her walking to the village with a basket of food for the poor families. He saw her sitting by her window in the evenings, reading by candlelight. And one night, as he rode past later than usual, he saw her through the gap in her curtains, sitting on her bed with her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Something broke open in Julian's heart that night. This woman, who gave her last coins to beggars and mended the clothes of children who were not her own, was weeping alone in the dark. She had been cast out, judged, and abandoned by the very society that should have protected her. The man who had ruined her was living freely in Italy, facing no consequences, while she paid the price every single day. Julian made a decision. He would learn everything about her situation. He would find out the truth of what had happened. And if she was indeed the woman of character she appeared to be, he would do something about it. He returned to London and immediately hired the best private investigator in the city, a discreet man named Mr. Jacobson who specialized in digging up secrets. The instructions were simple. Find out everything about Lord Edmund Hartley, his current whereabouts, his activities, his finances, and his history with women. Then find out everything about Lady Eleanor Ashford, her family, her circumstances, and the exact details of the scandal that had ruined her. The report came back 2 weeks later, and it made Julian's blood boil. Edmund Hartley was a predator, plain and simple. Eleanor was not his first victim. There were at least 3 other women he had seduced and abandoned, though their families had managed to keep the scandals quiet. He was currently living in Rome on money he had stolen and swindled from various sources, including Eleanor's dowry. He frequented casinos, kept a mistress, and showed no remorse whatsoever for the lives he had destroyed. As for Eleanor, the report confirmed everything Julian had observed. She was a woman of impeccable character who had made one terrible mistake. She had trusted the wrong man. Her father had indeed died shortly after the scandal, and her mother had passed away the following year. She now lived on a modest income, barely enough to keep her small household running. She had no prospects, no future, and no hope of ever rejoining society. She was condemned to live out her days in quiet isolation, all because she had believed a liar's promises. Julian sat in his study, staring at the report, and felt something he had not felt in years. Purpose. He was the Duke of Silverton. He had power, influence, and wealth beyond measure. And he was going to use every bit of it to give this woman back her life. But he would not do it as an act of charity. He would not swoop in like some benevolent lord offering pity. Eleanor deserved better than that. She deserved to be seen, truly seen, for who she was. And as Julian sat there in the firelight, he realized something startling. He was not just interested in helping her. He was interested in her. The woman who wept at night but gave away her last coins during the day. The woman who had survived 3 years of shame and isolation without becoming bitter or cruel. That woman fascinated him in a way no London debutante ever had. He called for his secretary and dictated a letter. It was addressed to Lady Margaret Thornfield, Eleanor's cousin. He had learned that Margaret was one of the few people who still maintained contact with Eleanor. The letter was carefully worded, suggesting that perhaps it was time for Eleanor to return to London, if only for one evening. The Winterbourne ball would be the perfect opportunity. Julian made sure that Margaret and her husband received coveted invitations, with the understanding that they could bring a guest. He knew Eleanor would be terrified. He knew society would be cruel. But he also knew that if she could find the courage to walk into that ballroom, he would be there waiting. And he would make sure that by the end of the night, everything would change. Not just for her, but for both of them. The Duke of Silverton had made his decision. Lady Eleanor Ashford deserved a champion, and he intended to be exactly that. Eleanor made the journey to London with her stomach in knots. Every mile that passed felt like a step closer to her own execution. She sat in the coach her cousin had sent for her, watching the countryside give way to towns, then villages, and finally the sprawling chaos of London itself. The city looked exactly as she remembered it. Grand townhouses lined the streets, their windows glowing with warm light. Well-dressed people strolled along the pavements, and the air smelled of coal smoke, horses, and expensive perfume. Nothing had changed. Except her. The coach pulled up in front of the Thornfield townhouse in Mayfair, one of London's most fashionable districts. Eleanor's hands were shaking as a footman helped her down. Before she could even straighten her traveling cloak, the front door burst open and Margaret came rushing out, her face bright with joy. "Eleanor! Oh, my dearest girl, you came." Margaret pulled her into a fierce embrace, and for a moment, Eleanor felt safe. Margaret had always been like an older sister to her, warm and protective. But even Margaret's warmth could not chase away the cold dread in Eleanor's stomach. Inside, the townhouse was beautiful and elegant, everything Eleanor's cottage was not. Margaret led her upstairs to a lovely guest room with a fire already crackling in the hearth. A maid brought tea and cake, and Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand. I know you are frightened, Margaret said gently. But you are so brave for coming. 3 years is long enough, Eleanor. It is time to show them that you are still here, still standing. Eleanor tried to smile, but her lips trembled. What if they are cruel, Margaret? What if they laugh at me? Then they are small-minded fools who are not worth your concern, Margaret said firmly. You will walk into that ballroom with your head high, and I will be right beside you every step of the way. I promise. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Margaret was determined to make sure Eleanor looked her absolute best for the ball. She insisted that Eleanor borrow one of her gowns, a beautiful creation in pale ivory silk with delicate embroidery along the bodice. It was simple but elegant, and when Eleanor tried it on, even she had to admit it was lovely. Margaret's lady's maid spent an hour arranging Eleanor's dark hair into an elegant style, with soft curls framing her face. Eleanor had not worn her hair fashionably in 3 years. She had not worn a ball gown in 3 years. She had not even looked at herself in a full-length mirror in 3 years. Now, standing in Margaret's dressing room, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked like the girl she used to be, before Edmund, before the scandal, before everything fell apart. You look beautiful, Margaret whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Absolutely beautiful. But Eleanor felt like a fraud. Beautiful on the outside, broken on the inside. She wanted to run back to Somerset, back to her quiet cottage where no one looked at her with judgment or pity. But she had come this far. She would see it through. The night of the Winterbourne ball arrived cold and clear. The Duke of Winterbourne's mansion was lit up like a jewel box, with torches lining the drive and carriages queuing for half a mile. Eleanor sat beside Margaret in their coach, her gloved hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Breathe, darling, Margaret murmured. Just breathe. They stepped out of the coach and joined the flow of guests ascending the grand marble staircase. Eleanor kept her eyes down, trying to make herself small and invisible. But invisibility was impossible. The moment they entered the ballroom, she felt it. The shift in the air. The turning of heads. The sudden hush that rippled out from where she stood like a stone dropped in still water. She forced herself to look up. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting dancing light across the polished floor. There were hundreds of people there, maybe 500, all dressed in their finest silks and jewels. And every single one of them seemed to be looking at her. The whispers started immediately. She could not hear the words, but she could see the fans snapping open, the heads leaning together, the eyes cutting toward her with unmistakable recognition. Lady Eleanor Ashford. The ruined rose. She's actually here. Can you believe the audacity? An elderly woman Eleanor had known before the scandal, Lady Pemberton, walked directly past her without acknowledgement, as if Eleanor were invisible. A group of young ladies Eleanor's own age, girls who had once giggled with her over tea, turned their backs in perfect unison. A gentleman she had danced with years ago caught her eye and then deliberately looked away. The cut direct. That was what they called it in society. The ultimate snub. To look at someone and pretend you did not see them. To treat them as if they did not exist. Eleanor felt each cold shoulder like a physical blow. Her chest tightened. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. She had been a fool to come here. A stupid, desperate fool. Eleanor. Margaret's grip on her arm tightened. Do not run, please. Just a little longer. But Eleanor could not breathe. The ballroom felt like it was closing in on her, the faces blurring together into a wall of judgment. She took a step backward, ready to flee, ready to leave London and never come back. And then the entire atmosphere of the room changed. A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd like wind through a wheat field. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the grand entrance at the top of the stairs. The orchestra faltered for a moment, then picked up with renewed energy. Eleanor followed the gaze of the crowd and saw why. A man had just entered the ballroom. He stood at the top of the marble staircase, tall and commanding, dressed in perfectly tailored black evening clothes that made him look like a prince from a storybook. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was startlingly handsome, all sharp cheekbones and strong jaw. But it was not his looks that commanded the room. It was his presence. He radiated power and authority, the kind that came from old blood and older money. "The Duke of Silverton," someone near Eleanor whispered, the words filled with awe. Eleanor had heard of the Duke of Silverton, of course. Everyone had. He was a legend in London society, the most eligible bachelor in England, maybe in all of Europe. Mothers dreamed of him for their daughters. Debutantes practiced their curtsies in case they ever got the chance to meet him. He was untouchable, unreachable, a man so far above ordinary people that he might as well have been royalty. The Duke descended the stairs with unhurried grace. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Young ladies blushed and curtsied as he passed. Mothers pushed their daughters forward, hoping for a glance, a word, anything. But the Duke did not seem to notice any of them. His eyes, a striking gray even from a distance, were scanning the ballroom as if he were looking for something. Or someone. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall near a marble pillar, trying to disappear into the shadows. She did not belong in the same room as a man like that. She did not belong in this ballroom at all. She was just about to tell Margaret that she absolutely had to leave when something impossible happened. The Duke's eyes found her. Across the entire expanse of that glittering ballroom, through hundreds of people, his gaze locked onto hers. And he stopped walking. Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest. She must be imagining it. There was no reason for the Duke of Silverton to look at her. No reason at all. But he was looking at her, his expression unreadable, his focus absolute. And then, to her utter shock and horror, he began walking again. Toward her. The crowd noticed. Of course they noticed. Speculation erupted in frantic whispers. Asterisk, who was he walking toward? Surely not Lady Ashford? Impossible. Perhaps he was heading for someone behind her. That had to be it. Asterisk. But there was no one behind her. Just the wall and the pillar and her own terrified, frozen form. The Duke of Silverton walked straight through the crowd, his eyes never leaving hers, until he stood directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He bowed, a perfect, respectful bow that made her heart race with confusion. "Lady Eleanor Ashford, I believe?" His voice was deep and smooth, cultured but not cold. Eleanor's mouth went dry. She managed a clumsy curtsy, her legs shaking. "Your Grace, we have not been introduced." A slight smile touched his lips, and it transformed his entire face. "Then allow me to remedy that unforgivable oversight." The ballroom had gone completely silent. 500 people were holding their breath, watching this impossible scene unfold. The Duke of Silverton stood before Eleanor, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. She could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her back, could hear the frantic rustle of fans and the sharp intake of shocked gasps. This could not be happening. Men like the Duke of Silverton did not approach women like her. Ruined women. Scandalous women. Women who had been cast out of polite society. "Lady Eleanor," he said again, his gray eyes warm despite the formality of the moment. "I realize this is highly irregular, but I find I cannot let the evening pass without making your acquaintance." He paused, and then said the words that would change everything. "Would you do me the very great honor of dancing the next waltz with me?" The ballroom erupted in whispers. Eleanor heard a woman behind her gasp so loudly it sounded like a small scream. Someone dropped their champagne glass, and it shattered on the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the sudden chaos. The Duke of Silverton had just asked the ruined Rose to dance. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. It was social suicide. Eleanor's mind went blank with panic. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she managed to stammer. "Your Grace, I cannot. You do not understand. I am no longer." She could not even say the words. Suitable. Respectable. Worthy. The Duke's expression did not change. If anything, his gaze grew more intent, more focused. "You are Lady Eleanor Ashford," he said clearly, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "And you are the woman I wish to dance with. That is all that matters to me." As if the orchestra had been waiting for exactly this moment, the opening strains of a waltz began to play. The timing was so perfect it felt orchestrated, though Eleanor had no way of knowing that the Duke had indeed arranged it. He extended his hand to her, palm up, waiting. Eleanor looked at his hand like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She knew she should refuse. She knew that accepting would only make things worse, would drag him into her scandal, would ruin him the way she had been ruined. But Margaret's hand was on her back, gently pushing her forward, and the Duke's eyes were so steady, so certain, that she found herself placing her trembling fingers in his. His hand closed around hers, warm and strong, and he led her onto the dance floor. The crowd parted for them, but no one else moved to join the dance. They stood in a wide circle, watching, whispering, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and barely concealed delight at the scandal unfolding before them. The Duke placed his other hand at Eleanor's waist, positioned her hand on his shoulder, and began to lead her through the waltz. Eleanor had not danced in 3 years, but her body remembered the steps. Or perhaps it was simply that the Duke was such a skilled partner that he made it impossible for her to stumble. They turned and swayed across the floor, alone in a sea of watching eyes. Eleanor could barely breathe. "Your Grace," she whispered urgently, her voice breaking. "You do not understand what you are doing. I am ruined. This will taint you. People will talk. They will judge you for even speaking to me." The Duke looked down at her, and something in his expression shifted. The polite formality melted away, replaced by something fierce and protective. "Then let me speak plainly, Lady Eleanor," he said, and his voice was no longer quiet. It was clear and strong, meant to be heard by everyone in the ballroom. "I have made inquiries into your history. I know what befell you 3 years ago." Eleanor felt her face flame with humiliation. He knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew. That was the problem. But the Duke was not finished. "I know that you were betrayed by a scoundrel named Edmund Hartley. I know that he made you promises he never intended to keep. I know that he stole from you, lied to you, and abandoned you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People were pressing closer now, straining to hear every word. This was better than theater, better than any gossip column. The Duke of Silverton was publicly discussing Lady Ashford's scandal, and no one could look away. "I know," the Duke continued, his voice ringing out across the ballroom, "that you were the victim of a cruel deception. Not the perpetrator of some moral failing, but the victim." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever said that before. No one had ever called her the victim. Society had blamed her, judged her, cast her out as if the entire scandal had been her fault. "I know that you have spent 3 years in exile," the Duke said, and now his voice softened slightly, became more intimate even though he was still speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Not because you are unworthy of society's respect, but because society itself is unjust and hypocritical." More couples were slowly joining the dance now, unable to resist the pull of the music, but they stayed close, their ears practically twitching with the effort to hear every word. "I know that you weep at night," the Duke said, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. How could he possibly know that? "I know you grieve for the life that was stolen from you, for the father you lost, for the future that was taken away." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, hot and unstoppable. She could not hide them, could not wipe them away without letting go of the Duke. She was crying in front of 500 people, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "And I know," the Duke said, his gray eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her heart race, "that you are the most courageous woman in this entire ballroom tonight." The music swelled around them, the waltz building toward its crescendo. The Duke's hand tightened slightly at her waist, steadying her, supporting her. "You walked into a room full of people who had rejected you," he said. "You held your head high even when they turned their backs. You faced your worst fears because you refused to hide anymore. That, Lady Eleanor, is true courage. That is true strength. And that is why I wanted to dance with you." Eleanor could barely see him through her tears. Her throat was too tight to speak. All she could do was let him lead her through the dance, let him hold her up when her legs felt too weak to carry her. The music began to slow, the waltz approaching its end. The Duke's voice dropped lower now, meant only for her. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Eleanor. Something I wish to ask you before we return to the judgment of this crowd." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. What is it?" she managed to whisper. The Duke's expression was serious, almost nervous, as if he were the one taking a risk here. "I am tired of empty smiles and meaningless courtships," he said quietly. "I am weary of women who want my title and my fortune but have no interest in the man who bears them. I have been searching for something real, something honest, and I have not found it in any London ballroom." The music was fading now, the final notes drawing out. "But then I saw you in Somerset," he continued, and Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. "I saw you give your last coins to a beggar woman and her children. I saw you work in your garden and visit the sick. I saw you weep alone at night for a pain you did not deserve. And I saw a woman of true character, true compassion, and true courage." The waltz ended. The music stopped. And in the sudden, profound silence of the ballroom, with 500 people watching and listening, the Duke of Silverton did not release her hands. Instead, he held them more firmly and spoke the words that would echo through London society for years to come. "Lady Eleanor Ashford, I have a proposition for you." The ballroom was so quiet that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The Duke of Silverton stood before her, still holding her hands, his gray eyes steady and unwavering. Every person in that vast room was frozen, waiting, watching. Even the orchestra seemed afraid to breathe. 500 witnesses to whatever was about to happen next. "Lady Eleanor Ashford," the Duke said, his voice clear and strong enough to carry to every corner of the ballroom. "I have a proposition for you." Eleanor's lips trembled. She could not speak, could not move, could barely think. What could the Duke of Silverton possibly want to propose to her? Here, now, in front of everyone? The Duke took a breath, and when he spoke again, his words were deliberate and careful, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. "I am tired of empty smiles and meaningless courtships. I am weary of women who want my title and my fortune but have no interest in the man who bears them." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. The Duke was publicly criticizing the very marriage market that every person in this room participated in. Mothers looked affronted. Debutantes looked stricken. But the Duke did not seem to care. "I have been searching for something real, something honest," he continued, "and I have not found it in any London ballroom. But then I saw you." His eyes found Eleanor's again, and the intensity in them made her knees weak. "I saw you in Somerset, Lady Eleanor. I saw you give your last coins to a beggar woman with 3 hungry children. I saw you tend your garden and visit the sick. I saw your kindness, your strength, and your grace under circumstances that would have broken a lesser person. Eleanor's mind was reeling. He had seen her in Somerset? When? How? She tried to remember if she had ever noticed him, but she could not recall. She had been so lost in her own small world of grief and routine that she would not have noticed the king himself riding past. You have been through fire, the Duke said, his voice growing more passionate. And you have emerged with your integrity intact. You have known betrayal and loss, and yet you still extend compassion to others. You are kind when the world has been cruel to you. You are generous when you have so little. You are brave when you have every reason to hide. Eleanor's tears were flowing freely now, hot streams down her cheeks that she could not wipe away. She was dimly aware of other women in the crowd dabbing at their own eyes with handkerchiefs, moved despite themselves by the Duke's words. You are precisely the woman I have been searching for, the Duke said, and now his voice rang out with absolute conviction. Not because you are perfect, not because you have never made a mistake, but because you are real. You are honest. You are worthy of respect and admiration and love. The word love hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. The crowd gasped collectively. Eleanor felt dizzy, as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet. And then the Duke of Silverton spoke the words that would change her life forever. I am saying that I wish to court you, Lady Eleanor, publicly, properly, and with the full intention of making you my Duchess. The ballroom exploded. It was not polite murmuring anymore. It was chaos. Women shrieked. Men exclaimed in disbelief. Fans fluttered frantically. A woman near the back actually fainted and had to be caught by her husband. The noise was deafening, a roar of shock and scandal and disbelief. Eleanor's knees buckled. She would have fallen if the Duke had not been holding her hands. He steadied her, his grip firm and reassuring, and stepped closer so that his presence shielded her from the gawking crowd. You cannot mean this, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. Your Grace, I am ruined. I am a scandal. Marrying me would destroy your reputation. Society would never accept it. They would never accept me. The Duke's expression was fierce now, protective and almost angry. You are not ruined, he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. You were wronged. There is a difference, and I will not allow anyone, including you, to use that word to describe yourself ever again. He turned then, still holding Eleanor's hand, and faced the crowd. His ducal authority was in full force now, the kind of commanding presence that had been bred into his bloodline for generations. When he spoke, his voice was like steel. Let it be known to everyone present, he announced, his words echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. Lady Eleanor Ashford is under my protection and my regard. She is the woman I have chosen to court, and if fortune favors me, the woman I will marry. He paused, letting that sink in, his eyes sweeping across the crowd like a king surveying his subjects. Any person who shuns her, any person who speaks ill of her, any person who treats her with anything less than the respect she deserves will answer to me. And I assure you, I have a very long memory and considerable influence. The threat was unmistakable. The Duke of Silverton controlled vast estates, held seats on important committees, had the ear of Parliament and even the Prince Regent himself. To cross him was to risk social and financial ruin. Every person in that ballroom understood that immediately. The transformation was instantaneous and almost comical to watch. Lady Pemberton, who had cut Eleanor directly not an hour ago, suddenly rushed forward with tears in her eyes. Dear Lady Eleanor, she gushed. How wonderful to see you again. You look absolutely radiant. The group of young ladies who had turned their backs now pushed forward, all smiles and apologies. "We have missed you so terribly," one of them lied shamelessly. "You must come to tea next week." All around the ballroom, people who had shunned Eleanor were now falling over themselves to curry favor with her. They curtsied and bowed. They complimented her gown. They welcomed her back to London with open arms, as if the past 3 years had never happened. Eleanor watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. These were the same people who had destroyed her. The same people who had whispered about her, judged her, and cast her out. And now, because a powerful man had decided she was worthy, they were pretending they had never been cruel at all. Margaret pushed through the crowd and reached Eleanor's side, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered, embracing her cousin. "Oh, my dear girl." The Duke released Eleanor's hand for a moment to allow the cousins their embrace, but he did not step away. He remained close, a solid protective presence at her side. Lord Thornfield, Margaret's husband, approached and bowed respectfully to the Duke. "Your Grace, this is most extraordinary. Most extraordinary indeed. We are honored. Deeply honored." The Duke inclined his head politely, but his attention remained on Eleanor. She was overwhelmed, shaking, her face wet with tears. The shock of what had just happened was beginning to settle in, and with it came a wave of emotions she could not name. Relief, disbelief, fear, hope. Too many feelings to sort through. "Lady Eleanor needs air," the Duke said firmly, noting her pale face. "If you will excuse us." It was not a request. He offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it gratefully, needing his support to stay upright. He led her through the crowd, which parted immediately. People bowed and curtsied as they passed. It was surreal, like walking through a dream. Just an hour ago, these same people had treated her like a ghost. Now they treated her like royalty. The Duke guided her toward a set of glass doors that opened onto a large stone balcony overlooking the gardens. The cool night air hit Eleanor's face like a blessing. She took a deep, shuddering breath and felt some of the dizziness recede. Margaret followed them out, ever the proper chaperone, but she positioned herself discreetly at the far end of the balcony, giving them as much privacy as was decent. The sounds of the ball continued behind them, muffled now by the closed doors. Through the glass, Eleanor could see faces pressed against the windows, watching them. "They are all watching us," Eleanor whispered. "Let them watch," the Duke said quietly. "Let them see that I meant every word I said in there." Eleanor turned to face him, and for the first time since this impossible evening began, she truly looked at him. He was even more handsome up close, but it was not his looks that struck her. It was the kindness in his eyes, the sincerity in his expression. This man, this powerful Duke, had just risked his reputation for her. He had stood in front of London's elite and declared himself on her side. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me? You do not even know me." Eleanor stood on the balcony, the cool night air drying the tears on her cheeks, and stared at the Duke of Silverton. Her heart was still racing from everything that had just happened. The dance, the declaration, the entire ballroom watching as this man, this impossibly powerful man, had claimed her as his chosen woman in front of everyone. It felt like a dream, the kind she used to have in Somerset before waking up alone in her small cottage, remembering that dreams were for other people, not for ruined women like her. "Why?" she asked again, her voice steadier now. "Why would you do this for me? You do not even know me." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the stone balustrade as he looked out over the moonlit gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost vulnerable in a way that seemed at odds with the commanding presence he had shown in the ballroom. "I saw you weeping," he said simply. "In your garden in Somerset. I was riding past your cottage one evening, and I saw you through your window. You were sitting on your bed with your face in your hands, and your shoulders were shaking. You were crying so hard, and you were completely alone." Eleanor's breath caught. She remembered that night. It had been a particularly difficult day, the anniversary of her father's death. She had held herself together all day, going through her routines, helping at the vicar's charity, but when night came and she was finally alone, she had broken down completely. "I am not proud of having seen such a private moment," the Duke continued, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I did not mean to intrude. But once I saw you, I could not forget it. I could not forget the image of a woman weeping alone in the dark, carrying a pain she did not deserve." He turned to face her then, and in the moonlight, his expression was open and honest in a way that made her heart ache. "So I made inquiries. I learned your story. I learned about Edmund Hartley and what he did to you. I learned about your father's death and your mother's grief. I learned that you had been living in exile for 3 years, punished for a crime you did not commit." "It was not a crime," Eleanor whispered. "It was a mistake. A foolish, terrible mistake. It was a betrayal," the Duke said firmly. "You trusted someone who proved himself unworthy of that trust. That is his failing, not yours." Eleanor shook her head, fresh tears threatening to fall. "Society does not see it that way. They blame me. They say I should have known better, that I should have protected myself, that I should have been more careful." "Society is wrong," the Duke said, and there was anger in his voice now, though she knew it was not directed at her. "Society protects men like Edmund Hartley and punishes women like you. It is hypocritical and unjust, and I will not be party to it." He took a step closer, and Eleanor could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. "I have spent years in London ballrooms watching women perform for me. They smile and curtsy and say all the right things, but it is all artifice. They want my title. They want my fortune. They do not see me as a man, just as a prize to be won." There was pain in his voice, old pain that Eleanor recognized because she carried her own. "I began to believe that was all there was," he continued. "That genuine connection was impossible in our world. That I would have to settle for a marriage of convenience, a wife who would bear my children and manage my household but never truly know me or care for me." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost tender. "And then I saw you in Somerset. I saw you give your last coins to a beggar woman. I saw you carry food to sick families. I saw you work in your garden with dirt on your hands and peace on your face. I saw a woman who had every reason to be bitter and angry, and yet you were still kind. You were still generous. You were still good." Eleanor's tears were flowing freely now, but they were different tears than the ones she had cried for 3 years. These were not tears of grief or shame. They were tears of something she had forgotten how to feel: hope. "I do not deserve this," she whispered. "I do not deserve your kindness or your protection. I am not worthy of being a duchess." The Duke reached out then and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady, and it grounded her in this impossible moment. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. "May I tell you what I see when I look at you?" She nodded, unable to speak. "I see a woman who survived," he said quietly. "I see someone who was betrayed and broken, who lost everything, and yet did not become cruel or selfish. I see someone who gives to others even when she has almost nothing herself. I see courage and kindness and strength that most people in that ballroom could never understand." He squeezed her hand gently. "I see a woman who weeps at night because she has a heart big enough to hold all that pain. And I see a woman who deserves happiness, who deserves a second chance, who deserves to be loved for exactly who she is." The word love hung between them again, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years. "I have not allowed myself to hope for anything in so long," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I was so afraid. I am still afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently. That this is not real, she whispered. That I will wake up and find myself back in my cottage alone. That you will realize you have made a terrible mistake and regret ever speaking to me. That I will let myself believe in happiness again, and it will be taken away just like before. The Duke's expression was so tender it almost hurt to look at. I cannot promise that life will be easy, he said honestly. I cannot promise that people will not gossip or that there will not be challenges ahead. But I can promise you this. I meant every word I said in that ballroom. I want to court you, Eleanor. I want to know you, truly know you. I want to give you the time and space to know me as well, so that if you choose to accept my suit, you do so freely, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because you genuinely wish to. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, a gesture that was both chivalrous and intimate. I ask only for a chance, he said. Court me as I court you. Let us spend time together, talk together, learn about each other. And if at any point you decide this is not what you want, you are free to walk away. No pressure. No expectations. Just possibility. Eleanor looked at this man, this Duke who had appeared in her life like something out of a fairy tale. She thought about the 3 years she had spent in Somerset, the endless nights of tears, the days of quiet desperation. She thought about how she had given up on everything, on hope, on joy, on the possibility of ever being happy again. And then she thought about what he was offering. Not a rescue, not charity, but a genuine chance at something real. A courtship. Time to know each other. The possibility of choosing happiness instead of having it forced upon her or stolen from her. I do not know how to hope anymore, she said honestly. I have forgotten how. The Duke smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger and more carefree. Then let me hope for both of us, he said. Let me hope enough for 2 people until you remember how to hope for yourself. Will you allow me to do that, Eleanor? She looked into his gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and kindness. She thought about the ballroom behind them, about the way he had stood up for her in front of everyone, about the way he had defended her when no one else would. She thought about how he had called her courageous and worthy and good when she had believed herself to be none of those things. And she made a decision, a choice. For the first time in 3 years, she chose something for herself, not out of obligation or duty or desperation, but because she wanted it. Yes, she said, and her voice was steady now, certain. Yes, Julian. I would like that very much. I would like to be courted by you. I would like to know you and let you know me. I would like to see if this impossible thing might become something real. The Duke's smile widened, and Eleanor saw relief and joy flash across his face. Then we have an understanding, he said softly. And I promise you, Eleanor, I will do everything in my power to prove myself worthy of the trust you are placing in me. They returned to the ballroom together, and Eleanor felt like a different person than the terrified woman who had entered just hours before. The Duke's arm was steady beneath her gloved hand, and his presence beside her was like a shield against the world. The crowd parted for them as they walked, and this time, instead of whispers of scandal, Eleanor heard murmurs of admiration and envy. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The Duke did not leave her side. He introduced her to his friends, all of whom treated her with perfect courtesy. He danced with her twice more, which was scandalous in itself but only added to the romantic narrative already spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. By the end of the night, Lady Eleanor Ashford was no longer the ruined rose. She was the woman who had captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor in England. The weeks that followed were like living in a dream. True to his word, Julian courted Eleanor properly and publicly. He called on her every afternoon at the Thornfield townhouse, bringing flowers and books he thought she might enjoy. They took carriage rides through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour when all of society could see them together. They attended the theater, always with Margaret as chaperone, sitting in the Duke's private box where everyone could observe them. But it was the private moments Eleanor treasured most. The conversations they had in the Thornfield drawing room, talking about everything from poetry to politics. The way Julian listened to her opinions as if they actually mattered, as if she were his equal rather than some grateful woman beneath him. The way he made her laugh, something she had not done genuinely in 3 years. The way he looked at her, not with pity or lust, but with respect and growing affection. Society, fickle as always, embraced the romance wholeheartedly. It was the love story everyone wanted to tell. The ruined lady rescued by the noble duke. The fairy tale come to life. Invitations flooded in, all addressed to Lady Eleanor Ashford. The same women who had cut her dead at the Winterbourne ball now invited her to tea and called her dear friend. Eleanor found their hypocrisy both amusing and sad, but she accepted their overtures with grace. Julian had given her back her place in society, and she would not waste it. Lady Pemberton actually had the audacity to tell Eleanor at one garden party, "I always knew you were a good girl, my dear. I never believed those terrible rumors." Eleanor simply smiled and thanked her, though they both knew it was a lie. But Eleanor did not care about the hypocrites and the social climbers. She cared about the man who was slowly, carefully, winning her heart. Julian was patient with her in a way she had not expected. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give. He never demanded declarations of love or pressed for a quick engagement. He simply showed up, day after day, proving through his actions that he meant every word he had said on that balcony. 6 weeks after the Winterbourne ball, Julian invited Eleanor to visit his country estate. It was a bold move, even with Margaret accompanying them as chaperone, but Eleanor agreed. She wanted to see the place where Julian had grown up, the home he loved more than his grand London townhouse. The estate was magnificent. Rolling green hills, ancient oak trees, gardens that seemed to stretch for miles. But it was not the grandeur that took Eleanor's breath away. It was the way Julian's face lit up when he showed her his favorite spots. The library where he had spent countless hours as a boy. The stables where his beloved horse lived. The garden his mother had planted before she died. They walked through that garden on a perfect spring afternoon, the air sweet with the scent of roses and lavender. Margaret trailed behind them at a respectable distance, giving them the illusion of privacy. Birds sang in the trees, and the sun was warm on Eleanor's face. Julian stopped beside a marble fountain, its water sparkling in the sunlight. He turned to face Eleanor, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race. This was it. She knew it somehow. This was the moment everything would change. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. The Duke of Silverton, who had faced down an entire ballroom without flinching, was nervous. "These past 6 weeks have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, spending time with you, watching you smile and laugh again, it has been an honor and a joy." He took her hands in his, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch through her gloves. "You have taught me something important," he continued. "You have taught me that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to hope despite it. You were so afraid that night at the ball, but you chose to hope anyway. You chose to give me a chance. You chose to believe that happiness might be possible again." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being seen and understood by another person. Julian took a breath and then lowered himself to one knee on the garden path. Eleanor gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. Margaret, watching from a discreet distance, made a small sound of delight. "Eleanor Ashford," Julian said, looking up at her with those steady gray eyes. "I do not offer you this ring out of pity or obligation. I do not offer it because I want to rescue you or because I feel sorry for you. I offer it because over these past 6 weeks, I have fallen completely and irrevocably in love with you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the blue stone the exact color of Eleanor's eyes. "You are brave and kind and generous," Julian continued. "You are intelligent and thoughtful and funny. You make me want to be a better man. You make me believe in the possibility of real love, the kind I had almost given up hoping for. You have captured my heart completely, and I do not want it back." Eleanor was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she looked down at this man, this wonderful, impossible man who had changed her entire life. "Will you marry me?" Julian asked, his voice full of hope and vulnerability. "Not as an obligation, not out of gratitude, but as a choice? Will you choose me, Eleanor, as I have chosen you? Will you be my wife, my partner, my love?" Eleanor could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to nod her head frantically. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Julian. 1,000 times yes." The Duke's face broke into the widest smile Eleanor had ever seen. He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and then, propriety be damned, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was their first kiss, tender and passionate and full of promise, and Eleanor felt like she was flying. Margaret was crying and clapping behind them, and somewhere in the distance, servants who had been watching from the house began to cheer. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was laughing and crying at the same time. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she said, her hands cupping Julian's face. "I never thought I deserved to be this happy." "Then I will spend every day for the rest of our lives reminding you that you deserve all the happiness in the world," Julian said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips again. The wedding took place 3 months later. It was not the huge society spectacle it could have been. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony in the chapel on Julian's estate, with only close friends and family present. Eleanor wore a gown of white silk that Margaret had insisted on buying for her. Julian wore his dress uniform from his military days, and Eleanor thought he had never looked more handsome. As she walked down the aisle on Lord Thornfield's arm, Eleanor thought about the girl she had been 4 years ago. Young, naive, so easily broken. Then she thought about the woman she had become. Scarred, yes, but stronger for it. Wiser. More compassionate. More grateful for genuine goodness when she found it. Julian waited for her at the altar, and the love in his eyes was so clear, so real, that Eleanor felt her own heart might burst with it. The vicar performed the ceremony, and when it came time for the vows, Julian took her hands and spoke clearly. "Eleanor, I give you not just my name and my title, but my heart, my protection, and my promise that you will never weep alone again. Whatever sorrows come, we will face them together. Whatever joys await us, we will share them as one. I love you, and I will love you until my last breath." Eleanor's voice was steady when she made her own vows. "Julian, you gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You showed me that I was worthy of love when I believed I was beyond redemption. I give you all of me, my heart, my loyalty, my love, freely and completely. You are my choice, my partner, my home. I love you, and I will love you always." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that meant more than any amount of jewels, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her with such joy and tenderness that everyone watching had to wipe away tears. The breakfast that followed was small but joyful. Margaret gave a toast, crying through the whole thing, about how love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. Lord Thornfield made a joke about how the Duke had always had impeccable taste. And Julian simply held Eleanor's hand and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. That night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Julian and Eleanor stood together in the garden where he had proposed. The stars were bright overhead, and the summer air was warm and sweet. "Are you happy?" Julian asked, pulling her close. Eleanor thought about the question. She thought about the 3 years of tears, the pain and shame and loneliness. She thought about how she had believed her story was over, how she had given up on ever feeling joy again. And then she thought about this man, this incredible man who had seen her at her lowest and decided she was worth fighting for. "I did not think I could ever be this happy," she said honestly. "I wept for 3 years believing my life was over, believing I would never be anything more than the ruined rose. But you showed me I was wrong. You showed me that one mistake does not define a person, that the end of one's story can be the beginning of a better one." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You gave me back more than my place in society, Julian. You gave me back myself. You gave me permission to hope again, to dream again, to believe that I deserved happiness. And now I have more than I ever dared to dream of. I have you." Julian kissed her softly, sweetly, and then held her close as they stood together under the stars. "We have each other," he said. "And that is enough. That is everything." 1 year later, Eleanor sat in that same garden, a book open in her lap but forgotten. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. She was radiant with health and happiness, glowing in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with being deeply, genuinely loved. Julian came walking down the garden path, and Eleanor's face lit up the way it always did when she saw him. He sat beside her on the bench and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "A letter came today," he said. "From Italy. Edmund Hartley has been arrested for fraud and theft. It seems he tried to cheat the wrong nobleman out of money, and now he is sitting in an Italian prison awaiting trial." Eleanor waited for the rush of vindication, of satisfaction, of anger. But all she felt was a distant sort of pity. "I hope he finds a way to change," she said quietly. "I hope prison teaches him something about the consequences of hurting people." Julian looked at her with admiration. "You are far more generous than he deserves." Eleanor shook her head. "I am not being generous. I simply do not have room in my heart for anger anymore. He is part of a past that no longer defines me. He took 3 years of my life, but I will not give him another moment. I have too much to be grateful for." She looked around at the beautiful garden, at the home she now shared with Julian, at the future stretching ahead of them bright and full of promise. "I wept for 3 years, she said softly. "But those tears are done now. Now I only cry from joy, from laughter, from being so happy I can hardly contain it." Julian wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "You deserve every moment of that happiness," he said. "You deserve all of this and more." And Eleanor, who had once believed she would never deserve anything good again, finally believed him. The story of Lady Eleanor Ashford and the Duke of Silverton became legend in London society. People told it at dinner parties and wrote about it in their diaries. It became the story mothers told their daughters about never giving up hope, about how the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. But for Eleanor and Julian, it was simply their story. The story of two people who found each other when they both needed it most. The story of a woman who learned she was stronger than her worst moment. The story of a man who chose love over convention. The story of a second chance that became a forever love. She had wept for years, believing her life was over. But then the most desired duke in England offered her something far greater than redemption. He offered her real love, freely given, in front of everyone who had once judged her. And in doing so, he gave her back not just her place in the world, but her belief in herself. Sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of something better. Sometimes, the people who see you at your worst are the ones who help you become your best. And sometimes, love does not rescue you. It simply reminds you that you were never as broken as you believed. Eleanor had learned all of that and more. And as she sat in her garden, her husband beside her and their child growing within her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done weeping. Now, she was simply living. And it was more beautiful than any fairy tale she could have imagined.